Hey everyone, Steve from Backcountry Gallery here, and this time around I want to show you a Photoshop trick for blurring out your backgrounds. Now, I know it's been a while since I've done a Photoshop tip, so try not to fall out of your seat. Oh, before we begin, remember that if you enjoyed this video, the best way to say thank you is to share it with your friends. And a big thank you to everyone who does share these videos. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Now, see, I don't know about you, but I'm a sucker for a nice, soft, clean background. The problem is, you typically need a fast lens on a full-frame camera to really pull it off. However, there are scores of folks out there shooting like f5.6 to f6.3 glass, sometimes even f8 glass if you're using teleconverters, and that's a recipe for busy backgrounds. Now, don't get me wrong, no Photoshop trick is going to replace the look of a 600 f4 and a D5. However, this little technique can certainly help if you don't have access to that kind of gear. For example, here's a before and after image from my D500 and a 200 to 500 f5.6. In the first image, I thought the background was just a bit too distracting, so I added a little blur to make the subject stand out better. Here's another example with the D500 and 200 to 500. I really didn't like the way the background looked in this one, so I softened it up just a bit, and I like the result much better than the original. Now, before we begin, full disclosure, this really isn't a technique I use very often simply because I usually shoot full frame and fast glass. Still, I know that many folks out there simply can't justify that kind of investment, and this technique can give you a similar look without dropping $18,000 or more on gear to pull it off. Now, when I do use this technique, I use it in a very subtle way. I find it's very easy to really overdo it, resulting in an image where the subject seems cut out of the background. My advice is to use this technique to simulate what the image would have looked like with a lens that was maybe another stop or two faster than the one you were using. You want the end result to look believable. So, with all that in mind, let's swing around to the computer and I'll show you how to do it. Oh, and by the way, yes, as with like every Photoshop technique ever, there are probably a dozen other ways to do it, but I'm going to show you the way I like to do it. Okay, so here's our sample image. It's a caracara I photographed in Costa Rica last year, and he was really cool. We were able to pull up right next to him in the car. I was using my 200 to 500 on my D5 at 320 millimeter, and even though I was shooting FX, the f5.6 kind of worked against me a little bit here. I wish this background was rendered a little bit softer. I probably would have been better off to have grabbed my 300 PF, but at the time I wanted the flexibility of the zoom. However, as you can see, these horizontal lines from the trees back there are a little bit distracting. My eye tends to go from the bird back to those. I'm kind of jumping around a little bit here. So what we're going to do is we're going to blur this background out a little bit so the bird stands out a little bit better from it. So let's go ahead and get started with that. Now, if you look over here, as you can see, I have been working on the image a little bit already. Now, if I'm going to soften a background, I usually do it after I get some of my preliminary work done first, although you really can do it at any point you like. Now, the only exception to that is if you are planning on doing some noise reduction. That should always be your first step anyway, although no matter what, get noise reduction out of the way before you do the blur step, and you'll see why here in a minute. So let's go ahead and get started with this. The first thing we want to do is we want to create a composite layer. Now, we can do that a number of ways. If you're only working off the background layer at this point, if you haven't put any other work into the project, go ahead and hit Command or Control J, and that'll duplicate your background layer. For most of us, if you already have some work done, you're going to want to make a composite layer, and you do that by hitting Command, Option, Shift, and E, and that will go ahead and give you a composite layer. Our next step is to select the bird. Now, there's 100 ways to select stuff, and I'm not going to go over everything here in the video. I'm just going to do it really quick and dirty here. You can select using your quick select tool or however, your lasso tool, whatever you like to do. I have the very newest version of Adobe Photoshop, at least at the time of this recording, and there's a cool feature under the select menu that you can use sometimes called subject. If you have a subject that's more or less isolated, this works pretty good. Watch, I'll show you. I'm going to click it, and Adobe Photoshop's going to go in, think about it, and it's going to select my bird, and actually it did pretty well. Now, the thing with selecting for this particular procedure is that the more blur you're going to plan to put in the background, and the busier the background is, you got to kind of think about them both, the more particular you have to be about your selection. In this case, there's nothing terribly busy around the bird himself, so a rough selection is all you need, and you'll see why here in a minute. So let's go ahead and separate him from the background, separate what we have here from the background. Just going to zoom in here, make sure we do have a pretty decent selection. I'm going to clean it up a little bit with my quick select tool here. Any place that looks like it could use a little bit of refinement. I see that it's kind of missing it here a little bit. Again, this does not have to be exact. We're missing his foot a little bit here, but that's not super important. I want to make sure that this is selected as well. I don't want to blur out the pull, although I can fix that afterwards. Now we do have a few flyaway feathers down here and over here, but we'll be able to fix those after we do this step. Again, if you were doing a lot of heavy blurring, you would have to worry about using maybe the select and mask tool to go ahead and really get all of those little flyaways. For what we're doing here for this example, we're going to skip that. It doesn't really matter for the way this one's going to work out. So the next step is to go to the layer menu and do a new layer via cut. We don't want copy, we want cut. That'll bring him off of this background layer. And if you look at the layer palette over here, you can see that there's now two different ones. Let me demonstrate for you here. If I click that, it's just the bird, and if I click that, it's just the background. And that's what we want. What you're going to do is select this background layer right here, not the one that says background, but the one that you just cut the bird from or the animal from. And that's the one we're going to want to blur. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and zoom down a little bit here so we can see the whole bird. Next, we're going to go to the filter menu to do our actual blurring, and we're going to go to blur gallery and select field blur. That's my favorite for this. And what we're going to do is grab the little handle right here and just kind of bring this up, and you can watch the background. He gets a glow around him, but when you release it, it looks normal. And you can kind of see the difference here. I'll uncheck the preview there. So you can kind of see how you're doing there. What you want to do is get just enough blur to accomplish what you're after, but not go crazy with it. When you go crazy with it, it can look really bad. So let me show you here. So in this case, it actually doesn't look terrible, but I think it's too much. In some cases, you'll find that it really, really gets unbearable. And you also can introduce a lot of posterization and banding and things like that. So just try to keep it realistic. That's how I do it. I try to make it look like maybe I shot an f4 lens instead of a 5.6. As a side note to this, I know a lot of people think maybe I can just crank this all the way up and then I'll just use opacity to kind of bring it back down later in the regular editing area in Photoshop. Maybe I'll just drop the opacity of that layer and let some of the sharpness show through. What I've found is that can give it kind of a weird look. It kind of has a sharp but soft look, and not in a good way, not like some glowy, cool way, but like, gee, what's wrong with the guy's lens way? So what you want to do is make sure that whatever blur level you set in here is really the one you want. Don't overdo it intending to drop the opacity later. Just pick something that looks good. Take a look at it. If you decide that it's not right, you can always, redo this, I suppose, if you want. So I'm going to put mine right about here, and I think that looks pretty good. If we check and uncheck, we've gotten rid of the hard horizontal lines that you see here, and we've softened those up pretty nicely. So I'm going to go ahead and go with that. You can still see there's a background. It looks realistic, and then once you're done, just hit OK. And there we go. But we're not finished yet. We still have to do a little bit of refinement to this image. We still have a few steps left. Now, this particular image, I'm going to be able to use just a black brush and a layer mask to sort of bring back some of these flyaways. You can see that we lost some of our flyaway feathers here, and we lost some stuff down here by the tail to the blur layer there, but we can go ahead and fix that. All we need to do is add a layer mask to the layer we're working on, our blur layer, if you want to call it that. We're going to take a brush with a black foreground color and make sure opacity is at 100%. Again, like I say, you don't want to do this in little half pieces. You want to make sure that it's either all or none, otherwise it can kind of look weird. The sharpness can kind of look a little bit weird. And I'm just going to take this brush and just kind of gently bring these back, some of these feather areas here. And I realize that we're bringing back some of the background and we're bringing back a little bit of the noise that went with it, and that's okay because we're actually, believe it or not, going to have to add noise back into this to make everything work. So I'm going to bring this down. I'm just going to trace this out here. So pretty easy to do. And just kind of gently go along the edge of him here. Basically just outlining the bird. Now the trick here is if you had a really detailed background or using a heavy amount of blur or both, you would have had to have made a much better selection of the bird. This technique of just kind of tracing the outlines there and catching all the little feathers and flyaways and things like that does not work as well if your background is really super busy. You have to really get in there and use your refine edge mask and really get a good selection, as I had said before. But in this case, it works pretty well. Now, as you can see, we have a super smooth background. That blur actually eliminated every bit of noise in the background, but in some cases that actually becomes a major problem. Depending on how high your ISO was when you shot the image, your tonal range might be really, really narrow, and the image actually can't handle having absolutely zero noise back there. What'll happen is you'll see all sorts of like banding and posterization, and it'll look really ugly. So what I do is I end up adding noise back into the image. This is why it's critical to do your noise reduction before you get to this step, because we're actually not going to use this as a noise reduction step at all, even though it looks like you could. We're going to add our noise back in and bring the noise level back to where it was when we started. And again, the reason for this is that if you don't do it, you risk having posterization in your images. You'll maybe convert this to a JPEG, an 8-bit JPEG, and then you'll say, gee, why is there some weird banding in the tonal transitions in that? Well, that's why, because there's not enough tonal range to handle it, and the noise will help keep that from happening. So let's go ahead, and what you want to do here is click the actual blur layer, and we're going to go to Filter, Noise, and we're going to add noise. And what we're going to do is make sure you're using Gaussian and monochromatic, and we're just going to add noise in until we can see that it pretty much matches these little tiny noisy areas we see right along the bird there. So I'm going to go ahead and raise this up. I'm just going to use my arrow keys, my up arrow, because you don't want to do this all at once. If you drag it over, it's just going to get really, really noisy really quick, and you won't be able to control it. So you need to do it like this. Most of the time, I don't even need 1%. There we go. That's looking pretty good. I may have gone a little too far there. I got excited. There we go. That looks pretty good. And again, a little bit of noise back there. I know it drives people nuts. Keep in mind, we're also looking at this at 200%. But I know it drives people nuts, but I'll tell you what, it really does help with posterization and banding. So there we go. And as you can see, at 100%, the noise doesn't look bad at all. It looks great. I would be happy to print this pretty much any size I'd want. And there we go. There's the final image, and no posterization. You'd see no banding in the background there. Everything looks good, and that's the basic technique. And before we go here, let me show you the before and afters here. This is what we had when we started, and that's what we have now. Much cleaner, much smoother background. The bird really stands out. Just watch how the bird looks when you turn that on and off. He really kind of pops out now. Your eye goes there. It doesn't try to go into the background at all. From here, I would just go ahead and finish my post-processing work and finalize the image. So there you go. Again, I want to stress that this technique is best done in small doses and can look contrived if you take it too far. Of course, in order to use any Photoshop technique, you need to start with great images right out of the camera, and that's where my ebooks, Secrets to the Nikon Autofocus System, Secrets to Stunning Wildlife Photography, and coming soon, Secrets to the Nikon Exposure System come in. All the books are jam-packed with hundreds of tips, tricks, and techniques to help bring your photography to the next level. The books themselves are very good at taking complex topics and making them easy for anyone to understand. Finally, remember to subscribe to the channel and make sure you stop by my site and sign up for my free email newsletter so you never miss an article or a video. Thanks again for watching. Have a great day.